Gold is just a metal. It's soft. You can't eat it. You can't build shelter with it. It has almost no practical industrial use compared to iron or copper or aluminum. And yet, for over 5,000 years, every major civilization on Earth has clawed, fought, conquered, and killed to possess it. Empires rose on it. Empires fell when they diluted it. Entire continents were colonized in the hunt for it. And today, right now, the most powerful central banks in the world are stockpiling it at a pace not seen in over half a century. So what is it about this strange, shiny, yellow element that makes human beings lose their minds? The answer has nothing to do with jewelry. It has everything to do with the one thing that holds economies together and tears civilizations apart: trust. This is the story of how gold became money, why it was taken away from us, and why it might be coming back. Most people assume that before money existed, humans bartered. You had fish, I had wheat, we made a trade. That story is in every economics textbook, and it's mostly wrong. Anthropologists who have actually studied ancient and indigenous economies found almost no evidence of large-scale barter systems. What they found instead were complex networks of debt, obligation, and social credit. You helped me build a wall, and I owed you something later. Communities tracked these debts through memory, reputation, and social pressure. It worked in small groups where everyone knew each other. But the moment societies grew beyond a few hundred people, the system started to crack. You can't track informal debts across a city of 10,000 strangers. You can't enforce social obligations between two villages that speak different languages and worship different gods. This is what economists call the coincidence of wants problem. For a trade to happen through barter, both sides need to want exactly what the other has at exactly the same time. The odds of that lining up consistently in a complex society are almost zero. So humans started searching for something that could sit in the middle of every transaction. Something everyone would accept, regardless of what they personally needed. That something had to be durable, portable, divisible, and universally recognized. Different cultures tried different solutions. Cattle worked for a while in pastoral societies. But cows die, they're hard to transport, and you can't split one in half to make change. And salt was used across Africa and parts of Asia, which is where the word salary comes from. But salt dissolves in rain and varies in quality. Cowrie shells circulated as money for centuries across vast trade networks, but they could be gathered from beaches, which meant the supply was impossible to control. Every commodity that humans tried as money eventually failed, because it couldn't solve all the problems at once. And then there was gold. Here is where the story gets interesting, because gold's rise to monetary dominance wasn't random. It was almost inevitable, and you can prove it by walking through the periodic table. There are 118 known elements. Most of them are immediately disqualified as money. Gases are out. You can't carry around a pocket of argon. Liquids are out, except mercury, which is poisonous. Radioactive elements will kill you. Highly reactive metals, like sodium and lithium, explode or corrode on contact with water or air. Iron rusts. Copper turns green. Aluminum, while abundant and lightweight, wasn't even discovered until the 19th century, and was once more expensive than gold itself. That leaves you with a small handful of candidates, the noble metals. Platinum and palladium have extremely high melting points, making them nearly impossible to work with using ancient technology. Silver is a strong contender, and was used as money for millennia, but it tarnishes and is more abundant than gold, making it harder to maintain value density. Gold stands alone. It doesn't corrode. It doesn't react with air, water, or most acids. It's rare, but not so rare that you can't find enough to circulate. It's soft enough to stamp, shape, and divide. It's dense, so a small amount holds significant value, and it's beautiful, with a luster that doesn't fade across centuries, which gave it spiritual and symbolic power in nearly every culture that encountered it. Around 600 BC, a king named Croesus in the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in what is now western Turkey, did something that changed the trajectory of civilization. He minted the first standardized gold coins, each one stamped with a consistent weight and purity, guaranteed by the authority of his kingdom. Before Croesus, gold circulated as irregular lumps and dust that had to be weighed and tested with every transaction. After Croesus, gold became true money, portable, countable, and trustworthy at a glance. Trade exploded. Lydia became fabulously wealthy. The Greek city-states adopted the idea, then the Persians, then the Romans. And with standardized gold coinage came something the ancient world had never seen at scale: reliable long-distance commerce between strangers who shared nothing except a belief in the value of the coin in their hand. But that belief came with a dangerous temptation. Rome built the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen, and gold was at the center of its economic engine. The denarius, Rome's primary silver coin, and the aureus, its gold coin, facilitated trade across 3 continents. Roman roads, aqueducts, and legions were all funded through a monetary system built on precious metal confidence. And then Rome did what every overstretched empire eventually does. It started cheating. The process was slow at first. Emperor Nero, around 64 AD, reduced the silver content of the denarius by about 10%. And most people didn't notice. The coins looked the same, spent the same, and the economy kept moving. But Nero had opened a door that would never close. Each successive emperor, facing military costs, bread subsidies, and the crushing expense of holding together a sprawling empire, shaved a little more silver out of the coins. By the reign of Gallienus, in the 260s AD, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was essentially a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. Prices responded exactly the way you would expect. Inflation tore through the Roman economy. The price of wheat in Egypt increased by a factor of 200 over the course of the 3rd century. Soldiers demanded payment in gold or goods because they knew the coins were worthless. Tax collection collapsed because nobody wanted to accept debased currency. Even trade networks fractured. The empire that had once connected Britain to Mesopotamia began to split apart, and monetary collapse was one of the driving forces. This was the first great lesson of monetary history, and arguably the most important one. You can dilute the money, you can stretch it, water it down, and print more of it, but you cannot escape the consequences. The purchasing power always adjusts. The trust always erodes. And once the people stop believing in the money, the system it supports begins to die. Every empire since Rome has eventually faced this same temptation, and every single one has given in. Fast forward about 1,400 years to an island nation that was about to stumble into the most important monetary innovation of the modern era, largely by accident. In 1696, England was in the middle of a currency crisis. The nation's silver coins had been clipped, counterfeited, and degraded to the point where nobody trusted them. The government brought in Sir Isaac Newton, yes, that Isaac Newton, to serve as warden and eventually master of the Royal Mint. Newton's job was to re-establish the integrity of England's coinage. He did this with ruthless precision, hunting down counterfeiters and overseeing a massive recoinage. But Newton also set the official exchange rate between gold and silver, and he got it slightly wrong. He overvalued gold relative to silver, compared to the ratios used on the European continent. The result was predictable. Silver flowed out of England to places where it was valued higher, and gold flowed in. Within a few decades, England was effectively operating on a gold standard. Not because anyone planned it, but because Newton's math pushed silver out of circulation. Britain formally adopted the gold standard in 1821, and this decision would define global finance for the next century. Under the gold standard, the British pound was defined as a fixed weight of gold. Anyone could walk into the Bank of England and exchange their paper notes for physical gold. This convertibility was the anchor. It meant the government couldn't print money recklessly because every pound in circulation had to be backed by gold sitting in the vault. And it worked. The period from roughly 1871, when most major economies had joined the gold standard, to 1914 is considered one of the most economically stable eras in modern history. Prices were remarkably steady across decades. International trade flourished because exchange rates between gold standard countries were effectively fixed. Investment flowed freely across borders because everyone was measuring value against the same yardstick. London became the financial capital of the world, and the pound sterling became the global reserve currency. But there was a cost that rarely makes it into the celebratory accounts. The gold standard imposed a brutal discipline, especially on farmers, debtors, and workers. Because the money supply could only grow as fast as gold was mined, the economy frequently experienced deflation, meaning prices fell year after year. That sounds nice if you are a saver or a creditor. It is devastating if you are a farmer who borrowed money to plant crops and now has to repay that loan with dollars that are worth more than when you borrowed them, while the price of your wheat keeps dropping. In the United States, this tension exploded into one of the most famous political moments of the 19th century. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan stood before the Democratic National Convention and delivered his legendary Cross of Gold speech, arguing that the gold standard was crucifying the common man for the benefit of Eastern bankers and creditors. Bryan lost the election, twice actually, but the anger he channeled never went away. It was a preview of a debate that would define the 20th century. Stability versus flexibility, sound money versus the ability to respond to crises. And the crisis that would settle that debate was already on the horizon. When the guns of August 1914 erupted across Europe, every major nation faced the same impossible math. Modern industrial warfare was unimaginably expensive. Shells, rifles, ships, uniforms, food for millions of soldiers, all of it had to be paid for on a scale no government had ever confronted. And the gold standard made it impossible. You cannot fight a total war when your money supply is limited to the gold in your vaults. Within weeks of the war's outbreak, every belligerent nation suspended gold convertibility. They printed money, they borrowed, they inflated. And 4 years later, when the smoke cleared, the old monetary order was in ruins. Britain, desperate to restore its pre-war prestige, attempted to return to the gold standard in 1925. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, pegged the pound back to gold at the old pre-war rate. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Britain's economy had been weakened by the war, its exports were less competitive, and the overvalued pound crushed British industry. Unemployment soared. Coal miners went on strike. The economic pain contributed directly to the political instability that would haunt Britain through the 1930s. John Maynard Keynes, who opposed the return to gold at the old rate, called it one of the most reckless decisions in modern financial history. Then came the Great Depression. As banks failed and economies contracted across the world, the gold standard became a straitjacket. Countries that stayed on gold were forced to tighten monetary policy during the worst economic downturn in history, deepening the suffering. One by one, a nations abandoned gold. Britain left in 1931. The United States took a different path. In April 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for American citizens to own gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates. Citizens were required to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve at a price of $20.67 per ounce. Once the government had collected the gold, Roosevelt revalued it to $35 per ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar by 40% overnight. The move was controversial, arguably unconstitutional, and it marked a fundamental shift. Gold was no longer the people's money, it was the government's money. Ordinary citizens were cut out of the system, and the state took full control of the monetary base. But even this wasn't the final act. In July 1944, with World War II still raging, Delegates from 44 allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The goal was audacious: design a new global monetary system from scratch. The United States held the strongest hand at the table, and it wasn't even close. America controlled roughly 75% of the world's monetary gold reserves. Its industrial base was intact. Its military was the most powerful on Earth. And so the system was built around the dollar. Under Bretton Woods, every participating currency would be pegged to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate, and the dollar itself would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Foreign governments could exchange their dollars for gold at that rate, but private citizens could not. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, the foundation on which all other money rested. It was an extraordinary position of privilege and power. But there was a fatal contradiction built into the design, identified early on by a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin. For the dollar to serve as the world's reserve currency, the United States had to run persistent trade deficits, sending dollars overseas so other nations could use them for trade and reserves. But running persistent deficits meant the supply of dollars abroad would eventually far exceed the gold backing them. At some point, foreign nations would realize there wasn't enough gold to honor all the dollars in circulation, and confidence would crack. This was the Triffin Dilemma, and it predicted exactly what happened. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the cracks widened slowly. The U.S. spent heavily on the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the space race, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Dollars flooded the global system. By the mid-1960s, the amount of dollars held abroad far exceeded the U.S. gold supply. And one man in particular decided to call the bluff. French President Charles de Gaulle, deeply suspicious of what he called America's exorbitant privilege, began systematically converting France's dollar reserves into physical gold. He sent warships across the Atlantic to collect gold from the vaults of the New York Federal Reserve. Other nations followed. Between 1958 and 1971, U.S. gold reserves dropped from over 20,000 metric tons to less than 9,000. The drain was relentless. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. He framed it as a defense against international speculators. He promised it was temporary. It was not temporary. The gold window never reopened. In one evening, the last link between money and gold was severed. The world moved to a system of pure fiat currency, money backed by nothing but government decree and public trust. What followed was turbulent. Inflation surged through the 1970s, hitting double digits in the United States. The price of gold, freed from its $35 peg, rocketed upward, reaching $850 per ounce by January 1980. Oil prices quadrupled during the 1973 embargo, then surged again in 1979. The combination of inflation, stagnant growth, and unemployment created a misery that defined the decade. To save the dollar, the U.S. struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. Oil would be priced exclusively in dollars, and in return, America would provide military protection for the Saudi kingdom. The petrodollar system effectively replaced gold as the anchor of the dollar's global dominance. You no longer needed gold to back the currency. You needed oil, and everyone needed dollars to buy oil. It was elegant, powerful, and deeply fragile in ways that would take decades to fully reveal. For a generation, gold seemed like a relic. After Paul Volcker's brutal interest rate hikes in the early 1980s broke the back of inflation, the dollar reasserted its dominance. Gold entered a long bear market, drifting down to around $250 per ounce by 1999. The central banks, particularly in Europe, were actively selling their gold reserves, treating them as an outdated asset. The Bank of England, under Chancellor Gordon Brown, famously sold over half of Britain's gold reserves between 1999 and 2002 at prices near the all-time low. That decision has since been estimated to have cost British taxpayers billions. But something shifted after the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars through quantitative easing, buying bonds and mortgage-backed securities to prevent the financial system from collapsing. Other central banks followed. The Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, all printed money at a scale that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. And quietly, central banks in the developing world started doing something they hadn't done in decades. They started buying gold. China led the charge. Between 2009 and 2024, the People's Bank of China more than doubled its official gold reserves, and many analysts believe the actual holdings are significantly higher than reported. Russia aggressively accumulated gold as Western sanctions cut it off from the dollar system. Poland, India, Singapore, Turkey, and dozens of other nations joined the buying spree. In 2022 and 2023, central banks purchased more gold than in any year since 1967. That is not a coincidence. It is a signal. These countries are not buying gold because they think it will go up in price next quarter. They are buying gold because they are hedging against a very specific risk: the possibility that the dollar-dominated monetary system is entering a period of structural decline. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have openly discussed creating alternative payment systems and potentially backing a new currency with gold or a basket of commodities. Whether that succeeds or not, the intent tells you everything about the level of trust in the current system. Meanwhile, gold has responded. It broke through $2,000 per ounce in 2023 and pushed past $2,400 in 2024, reaching levels that most mainstream analysts had dismissed as impossible just 5 years earlier. And it did this while interest rates were rising, which historically pushes gold down because gold pays no yield. The fact that gold surged even with higher rates suggests something deeper is driving the move, something beyond simple inflation hedging. Some analysts believe we are witnessing the early stages of a global monetary reset, a slow but accelerating shift away from pure fiat toward a system where hard assets, and particularly gold, play a larger role. Others argue this is just another cycle, that the dollar has faced doubters before and always survived. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But the pattern is hard to ignore. Here is what 5,000 years of monetary history teach us, compressed into a single idea. Every form of money that has ever existed has derived its power from one thing: trust. Gold earned that trust through its physical properties, through thousands of years of surviving every disaster, every war, every empire's rise and fall, without corroding, without losing its luster, without anyone being able to manufacture more of it out of thin air. Fiat currency earns its trust through institutional credibility, through the belief that the government issuing it will manage it responsibly, will not print too much, will not weaponize it, will not inflate away the savings of its citizens. When that institutional trust holds, fiat money works beautifully. It is flexible, responsive, and enables economic management that a rigid gold standard never could. But when that trust erodes, when debts pile up beyond any realistic repayment, when money printing becomes the default response to every crisis, when currencies are weaponized as tools of geopolitical conflict, then the ancient question returns: what is money really? And the answer that keeps coming back across every century, every continent, and every collapse is a soft, yellow metal that doesn't do much of anything except endure. Gold didn't become money because someone decided it should. It became money because everything else failed. And the real question facing us now isn't whether gold still matters. It's whether we are watching the early stages of the same pattern that has repeated across every overextended empire in history, or whether this time, somehow, the outcome will be different. 5,000 years of evidence suggests you should think very carefully before betting on different,